Right, for nearly 3 weeks now, Polish-Canadian pastor Artur Pawlowski has been detained at the Calgary Remand Center after joining a Freedom Convoy blockade in Alberta, Canada. He was in order to preach to and pray with those demonstrators. He went there to preach with them, preach to them, to pray with them, and he was arrested. Here to update us on his situation is Adam Soos. He's a reporter with Toronto-based Rebel News who has been tracking this. Adam, welcome to Washington Watch.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. Happy to be here.
All right, can you tell us about what's happened over the last 3 weeks with Pastor Artur?
Yeah, certainly. Again, all of this stemming back over the past 2 years with COVID restrictions. Obviously, some of the early charges against Pastor Artur Pawlowski stemming from the very get-go of COVID-19. Ultimately, what we have here, though, is a pastor who not involved in any sort of criminal activity. What he has done is opened his church, has fed homeless people, and has preached to people. But apparently in a COVID-19 world with COVID-19 restrictions, those actions are enough to garner the ire of political authorities and health officials in the province. So the latest incident, what effectively happened was Pastor Artur Pawlowski went down to the Coots Milk River blockade right opposite Sweetgrass, Montana, and he was with them for a short period of time. He prayed with them, and then he left. He has surprisingly and shockingly been charged under a relatively new law, the Critical Infrastructure Defense Act, which effectively allows for the government to sort of take extraordinary measures or have specific charges, largely intended for blockades of pipeline constructions or railways being blocked. In this instance, he's actually the first person in history to be charged under this specific act. The people who are actually physically blockading the border, the people who were there for weeks on end, they've not been charged under this act. Only Pastor Artur Pawlowski has been charged, and it's just further proof to the fact that he is very much a political prisoner, and he's being targeted as a pastor for daring to publicly decry the government. But more than that, what he's doing ultimately is simply preaching, opening his church, and feeding the homeless people on the streets here, the people who rely on him. So he has been behind bars, denied bail, apparently too great a liability to be released for about 3 weeks now, and he doesn't have a court date pending until March 10th or 11th. So he's going to be in jail at least that long. We do have a lawyer. We're crowdfunding legal fees for Pastor Artur at saveartur.com because he couldn't afford to stand up for himself with all of these charges coming against him. So we are hoping that the denial of bail will be appealed. But again, for the time being, he's in jail indefinitely.
So let me just get this straight, Adam. Pastor Artur was down there preaching, praying. He was not chained to a bridge. He was not lying across the road blocking it. He was just down there praying with and encouraging those that were there as a spiritual leader. And After he left, he was arrested.
Yeah, so effectively what happened, and this is part of the wild thing with all this that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. He actually went home and was at home for a while. Police know who his lawyer is. They never contacted his lawyer. Police know who he is and where he lives. They know where to find him. He was set to go down another time. So he's not even staying out there. He's there for a couple hours in the afternoon, then he leaves. He was set to head down again and join the people for prayer and do his job as a pastor, and then to leave again. And as he was ready to leave his house, basically ununiformed officers, plainclothes officers, and what amounts to basically SWAT teams stormed his house as he was walking down the steps and dragged him away, once again taking him into custody. This is the fifth arrest, the third time he's been incarcerated. And every time they do these dramatic SWAT-style arrests where the man has never not shown up for court. The man has never been violent whatsoever, but they keep doing these dramatic shows of force as though it's going to dissuade him from continuing to do his job as a pastor. And he's made pretty clear that it's not. We see criminals being granted bail. There was an incident at one of the protests along with the truck convoy in Winnipeg where someone actually rammed people in the crowd with their vehicle. They were reportedly granted bail, but a pastor who went and prayed with the people was not.
So, Adam, how are the people responding to this? I mean, do they not see this as yet another example of the overreach of the government?
I think unfortunately, given that we're one of the only outlets, there's a few out there certainly, but that is truly independent. Most media outlets, they get their funds from the government, and so it behooves them to play along and adhere to the government narratives. So I think Canadians are very complicit because we actually get far more traction on this story. People are far more concerned for this religious persecution from abroad. When we talk to people from Poland, Brazil, the United States broadly, a lot of support for Pastor Artur Pawlowski. They're extremely concerned. Senator Josh Hawley has even called for Canada to be added to a religious freedom violators list with the likes of China and North Korea and some of these other countries. Canadians, sadly, though, there is certainly a contingent that is like, this is ridiculous, particularly with the never-ending charges piling up. But unfortunately, I do think with the overwhelming narrative of bought and paid for media in this country, Canadians are not awake to just how bad it is. They've almost been desensitized to the fact that a pastor is behind bars. This is the type of thing we see in maybe China, certainly not the type of thing we should see in Canada. And I want to remind you that he's been in jail the most, but 3 pastors in Alberta, in my province here, have been arrested and spent time behind bars over opening their churches effectively.
Amazing. This is just happening north of our border. Although I would have to say, Adam, we've had our own share of government overreach here in the United States during this pandemic, and I have to say thank you to the Canadian truckers in particular for inspiring the truckers here in the United States, who we had on the program earlier today, as they're making their way here to Washington, D.C. So I was very encouraged by what I've seen in Canada, that there are those that still want to fight for freedom. And so our hats off to you, and thanks so much for joining us today as well.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right.